I've made a startling discovery. There's good evidence that's recently come to light that back in the Middle Ages, one of the kings of England was illegitimate. And if that's so, it means that every king and queen of our country since shouldn't by rights have sat on the throne. But if not them, then who? Well, I've traced the real royal family, the bloodline that's been robbed of its inheritance. And I've discovered the person alive today who should be Britain's reigning monarch. What am I doing making a fuss about a centuries-old skeleton in the royal family's closet? Well, to me, it's all about the rules of the club. The monarchy rests entirely on blood and inheritance. There's an absolutely rigid system for passing on the throne. Prince Charles is first in line, then Prince William, then Harry, then Andrew, etc. The chain of power and wealth and privilege depends on two rules. One, you have to be of the royal bloodline, and two, you have to be born legitimate. But what happens if the system goes wrong, if the chain gets broken? 500 years ago, that's exactly what happened, and this is the man responsible. Edward IV was king, but his claim to the throne was fatally flawed. I found evidence that he was conceived not by his royal father, but by a humble archer. Forget the history you know. Prepare to meet a Queen Margaret I, a King Henry X, and Queen Barbara I. But in tracing the rightful heirs to the throne, I wanted to follow the established royal rules exactly. As I'm no genealogist, I decided to start at Debrett's, the acknowledged experts on inheritance and the aristocracy. We've been doing a lot of work on Richard III and Edward IV, and we've come to the conclusion that Edward IV definitely was illegitimate. But I'm a bit stuck on working out where we should be looking for the true monarchical line once that happens. What are the rules here?
I'll get to family tree, and that will help to illustrate this question. The crucial point is that Edward IV was one of three brothers. And it wasn't just Edward IV and Richard III. There was a middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who had children. So his children actually would have taken precedence over Richard III. Because here, there's Edward IV.
Yeah.
There's George, Duke of Clarence. George's two children were the last of the Plantagenets. Edward, Earl of Warwick, who was a poor simple boy locked up in the Tower where he died, unmarried. But this intriguing lady, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, was the very last of the Plantagenets, and as such she was a threat to Henry VIII and the Tudor line. And Henry VIII was determined to get rid of her. Quite late, actually, in his reign, there was a trumped-up charge of treason, and she was done to death on the scaffold, and she was complaining to the last breath in her body.
And did she have children?
Yes, she did. She had quite a few sons, and it's through this line, again through the female line, that we followed this line of descent.
So I'd found my true Plantagenet heir, the person who should have been on the throne. I'm calling her Queen Margaret I. But her descendants survived. From Margaret, I had to trace an alternative royal family. She was the first step on the trail to find our real monarch today, and the trail led me north. The power base of our rightful rulers was a world away from Windsor and Westminster in Ashby de la Zouch in Leicestershire. Why Ashby? Well, it was the stronghold of the Hastings family. Queen Margaret's granddaughter married into this family. It was the offspring of this Hastings Plantagenet line that I had to follow. By the time of Elizabeth I, the heir to Ashby, and therefore our alternative Plantagenet monarch, was Henry Hastings, 3rd Earl of Huntingdon. Forget the bloke with the 6 wives, this is the real Henry VIII. This Henry was no less vicious than his namesake. Henry was known as the Puritan Earl. Up until now, the Hastings Plantagenets had been staunch Catholics. Don't forget that Henry's great-grandmother, Margaret, had actually been a Catholic martyr. But Henry instituted his own mini-Reformation and started persecuting the Catholics zealously. There's one story where he punished a housewife who'd been hiding a Catholic priest by laying her on the ground, putting a door on top of her, and then squashing her to death. Henry was happy to serve the Tudor Queen. He didn't know the rules had been broken, but records show she was only too aware of his pedigree. There's a lovely bit here that says that Queen Elizabeth became ill and she started worrying about the fact that she hadn't got an heir, and someone said to her, "Don't panic, because Henry, Earl of Huntingdon, has got a legitimate claim." And amazingly, she immediately became better. And that was the last time, until I came along, that there was any hint that the Hastings Plantagenets might actually have a claim to the throne. For hundreds of years, the royal family tree would weave its various branches through British history. It would survive threats and crises, but no one would look back at its roots and suggest the whole line of succession was fatally flawed. In 1960, when the present occupant of Buckingham Palace was still in the first decade of her reign, a young man set sail from England. He was heading for a new life abroad. He didn't know it, but he was leaving his kingdom behind. Good morning. After discovering a flaw in the royal succession, I traced the line of true kings and queens that leads to the person who's Britain's real monarch. But he'd emigrated. The true heir to the throne was born in Britain, but now lives in the Australian outback. His name is Michael Hastings. Armed only with my family tree and my increasing obsession with the subject, I went to tell the man who should be King Michael I the good news.
G'day.
Hello, Michael.
Yeah, come on in.
I'm Tony Robinson.
Hello, Tony. How are you?
This is our camera crew.
Come on in.
Thank you.
Would you walk?
Not from England, no. Michael, the reason that we've come over is that we've been doing a lot of research on the Plantagenets, of which you are...
One, yes.
A very distinguished one.
Very distant one too.
Just looking at the top bit, see, the kings of England, starting with Henry II and further back right to William the Conqueror and beyond that to Alfred the Great. I went over the now familiar pattern. Wars of the Roses, Clarence, Henry Tudor, and of course the missing link in the royal chain. All of that's okay, except that we now believe that Edward IV was himself illegitimate. Which means that Elizabeth was illegitimate, Henry VII was illegitimate anyway, so this whole Tudor dynasty is built on a lie. It means that you are the rightful King of England.
Well, there you are.
How do you feel about that?
Bloody awful, isn't it? I don't. Bit of a shock, isn't it?
Not Balmoral, not Sandringham, not Windsor, but Jerilderie in Australia, home to Britain's real monarch. Because if you think this is the royal family, think again. According to my calculations, this should be King Michael I, and his family include Simon the alternative Prince of Wales, Marcus, Lisa, Princes Jet, Zac, Caleb and Riley, not forgetting little Princess Isabella. Michael's day begins at 7:30, when he sets out on a half-hour drive to work. He works at the Australian Rice Research Institute. It's an enormous farm where Michael and two mates are engaged on an ongoing quest to find a sort of rice suitable for the parched landscape to feed Australia and Southeast Asia. One of the interesting things about our Plantagenet king is that he started off as a standard British public school boy with a title, but something in his character transformed him into a regular Aussie bloke who'd vote to get rid of the monarchy. After only a couple of days in the bush, I could see what attracted our real king to the tough but uncomplicated Australian lifestyle. I think I'd kick if you did that to me. But as soon as you start getting into the swing, there's always someone happy to point out that you're still a pom.
"40 years on, I'm still a pom." Or that pommy bastard, you know, one or the other. Yeah. Oh, yes, well, that's typical Australian, mate. Oh, yes. You know, I don't think I'll ever become a local.
It doesn't rankle?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Compared with the dysfunctional Windsors, our Plantagenet monarch lives right at the heart of a close-knit family and community. Whatever the gags and put-downs, it seemed to me that he'd made a life for himself out here that was far better than any that he could have had as King of Britain.
I'm friggin' working. At least I turn up. More than you friggin' do half the time. My wife had red hair. She was fairly fiery. I think I was not quite 21 when I met Noel, and I was 26 when we got married. She probably thought, "Oh, can I really marry a pommy?"
What do you think Nolene, an all-Australian girl, would have said if she'd known that she was really the Queen of England?
I think she would have probably said, "Get me another stubby, Michael. I think I'm going to need it."
If the Queen abdicated, if she said, "I've had enough of it," would you go back?
Probably not. Probably not.